Initially, the title sequence was going to be a bunch of floating shots going through the portals from one cube room to another. And as much as that was a good idea, I felt that this was a real opportunity to show more about the Hypercube. I gave this a lot of thought, and then I came up with the idea that what if we started over a texture, and as we panned across it, we saw that it was actually a blueprint. And as we pan across and pull out further and further, we see it's actually a blueprint for the Hypercube. And from that blueprint, we would eventually transition into the actual cube.
But we wanted to take it a bit of a step further because of the flat two-dimensional nature of the blueprint and the 4 dimensionality of the Hypercube idea in and of itself. And then to give other dimensionality to the overall sequence, we thought, well, it would be pretty cool if we started right deep in the paper in a sort of abstract world where we didn't really know what it was until we sort of do this cosmic pullback to reveal that we were actually inside paper. And to that end, we're in the fiber world, and then the thing gets saturated with ink and becomes all blue. And when we pull out of that, we're through an ink dot, which then becomes a line. So again, conveying the idea of a point, 0 dimensions, becoming a line, 2 dimensions, becoming the blueprint of the cube itself. And then we go through that opening title sequence into a fully 3-dimensional blueprint, which is like a wireframe rendering of the cube that draws itself on. But also, one thing that we really liked was the texture of blueprint paper and the idea of the sort of modeling that happens on paper for blueprints. Gave us an idea that it would be kind of cool if that was sort of created a 3D dimensional world of its own.
Where not only did everything come from all angles at us, and entire rooms grew in time, therefore adding the 4th dimension of time into it, but then we kind of crossed over into a negative world where we went from being blue lines on white paper to being white lines on dark blue space, and sort of to give us this idea of crossing over not only into a 4th dimension, but into kind of a parallel negative reality of the 4th dimension.
We always thought of sort of blueprint being blue ink on a lighter colored paper, and then we came across a bunch of blueprints that were actually the reverse, which are the negative blueprints of lighter ink on a darker blue paper, which are, I guess, photostats of blueprints come out that way. So we incorporated a nice sort of wipe into the 3D rendered wireframe that allowed us to transition into the dark one. And then down this sort of infinite tunnel of cubes that eventually start to blow out, that bring us back to the sort of dark type on white for the director's card, which then transitions nicely into the actual first scene of the film after the title sequence. The fiber world was created exclusively CGI, and then we color corrected and did an animating color correct on it for the saturating blue ink look. Then the transition from the fiber world to the 2-dimensional blueprint world was achieved through 6, 7, 8 different layers of various different fibrous textures.
We did a whole bunch of photography where we took things which kind of seemed to us like they could represent different levels of magnification along the trip. So we had things like bounce sheets, and we had piece of paper, some bond paper. I found some steel wool, some green scrub pads, some spaghetti, some chopped up paper, and a whole lot of other things which I photographed with a macro lens onto slow speed film. And then we scanned that, color corrected, and tried to paint up each still, and then stack them up in Z-Space and Inferno.
Basically, many different sources of fibrous type materials at different thicknesses that would allow us to sort of transition reasonably seamlessly from the thick, deep fiber world out to the actual flat paper surface.
And then from there, we do a dissolve and a morph into our 3D animation, which is scanned paper texture and ink texture that we comp together and then build a long camera move across the blueprint.
It was a very straightforward concept and rendered quite quickly because it was just two-dimensional geometry. There was no significant amount of geometry within the file itself. It was mostly texture maps and opacity maps to create the look. We drew on the blueprint of the cube with the appropriate sort of drafting type and arrows and dimensions and things like that. And then use that as an opacity map over top of a texture, which we scanned in also at very, very high res of an actual blueprint paper to get the actual blueprint paper texture.
And then from there, we do another kind of push into this netherworld, which we called 4D world. What we wanted to do is have the idea that we're kind of like spinning around inside this paper. So that was built with geometry and a camera spinning around, and to create different layers of kind of nebulae. We had just basically a giant sphere built with different layers, and then had texture mapped onto that, which we could then render out as a separate plate and then put into the background so that it looked like there's kind of layers of gunk spinning in the background.
And I think it was fun and got everybody into the mood of the movie. You know, how one of the purposes of a title sequence in a way is to get your audience into your world and into the mindset of the movie, so then they're ready to be kind of turned on by all these effects and concepts you're going to throw at them.
The virtual cube is a computer-generated replica of the actual cube set that they used to shoot the live-action portion of the film. It was created from actual precise measurements of the cube, plus the blueprints that were used to construct the cube. The textures were actual photographs of the materials that were used in the cube and applied to the CG model. There were sort of two main purposes. One was for effect shots where we needed to substitute one or more of the live action walls with actual computer generated walls, because either an effect was happening on the walls, such as the shimmering wall, or the razor sphere had to go behind a character yet still be in front of the wall, so the entire wall would have to have been replaced with the virtual cube. The other purpose of the virtual cube was, of course, to do these so-called impossible shots or impossible camera moves, where there was no way that we could have actually had a camera do the move that we did. For example, the 180-degree flipping over shot. We could have not have actually had a camera perform that move, so we used the virtual cube to substitute in with the actual live-action cube. To build the virtual cube was a process that was started, I guess, early in pre-production. We had the blueprints from the production designer, so we knew the dimensions. It was roughing in the geometry, but until we got the actual materials and were able to go and finalize our measurements with the actual cube built on set, it was a process that probably took a couple of months of hard R&D to get the perfect photoreal look.
We actually went up into the cube when it was first being built, took all the components of what it actually was constructed of and took like really close photographs of the material. We really wanted to get the material to look as realistic as possible, so we'd photograph different elements of the cube and then, you know, in 3D kind of map it onto different parts of the geometry.
Layers for the panels, for the bars, for the doors, all the layers for the reflections, the nuts and bolts, the ladder rungs, the gutters in the ladder, and all of those were created separately and then composited together with little lighting tweaks to be able to achieve the photoreal nature that we really needed for the cube.
You know, once we took some like light readings and got a good understanding of how the light actually affected the real cube, we were able to kind of replicate that in 3D.
Even though the cube is a relatively simple geometric construct, it was actually a fairly complicated task to achieve the photoreal nature that we actually needed for the virtual cube so that it would cut seamlessly with the live action.
It took about 2 months to kind of start getting it to look more realistic. We got it to a point where it was about an hour frame, and at that point, I think at the 2-month mark, maybe 2.5 months, doing some happy test renders, we got it to a point where it looked realistic, and we could probably do anything we wanted with it in terms of matching the real cube. At times it was a pain to kind of track the cube to the real live cube. But once we got past that hurdle, I think sky was the limit to what we wanted to do with the cube.
The incandescence of the panels, the reflections off the bars, reflections off the doors, were all minor details that we actually had to carefully look at to be able to sell the fact that this really was not a computer-generated image, but rather a photoreal version of the actual cube that we were looking at.
It was really bright, and at certain times there's reflections in the cube. There's some subtle reflectivity happening within the door frames and certain plastic parts of the cube that had to actually match the real live cube. And once those started to fall in place, then it worked out well.
The virtual cube was used in a number of shots in the film, both shots that were planned before we shot, as well as a number of shots that we made up after, during the post-production of the film. The 180-degree flip overhead shot was one that came about during post-production. We had the beginning of the shot, which was Kate and Sasha climbing out of the portal down into the cube, and we had the end of the shot, which was Kate and Sasha walking away from the camera up into the portal. So to create this 180-degree flip, we had to seam up the beginning of the shot with the live action, do a takeover in CG, flip the camera over, and then land in the exact spot of the end part of the shot where it all comes together again, creating one sort of seamless shot that starts with live action, takes over with the CG, and then goes back into live action.
There was about 90 to 100 shots where it's all virtual, or part of the frame is virtual. And I think one of the coolest parts about the film is that it's really hard to notice at points what is virtual, what's not.
The idea basically is for the viewer to have no idea that which shots are CG, which shots are live action.
How is it that you can walk through like a portal on one side of the wall and then come around the other side? And what it seems like is that there's all these other strings of rooms that are all kind of like passing through each other at all times, and you can walk through one and be transported to another or whatever just by this constant motion of this fourth-dimensional hypercube thing. And basically what we get to see when we pull back far out is just more representations of the shapes that we've seen in the Razor Sphere, and things that are looping around on themselves, and spatial dimensions represented through motion and geometry, I guess.
We wanted to early on show that space in this hypercube didn't behave as normal physical space would. So that's where the idea of one room passing through another and being dangerous to whoever's in the first room came. Also, I think in Sean Hood's original script of Hypercube, it was rooms where space was being twisted. And then again, working with Andrei Sekula's original idea of having the having everything work on a basis of cubes, we thought, well, the motion he wanted the motion to be much more linear than just sort of twisting space. And that we thought, well, wouldn't it be fun if there was a room from the future that was coming and passing through a room in the past? And that happens in the room passing sequence. So we don't really allude to it that much. You don't really kind of get it when it first happens. But then later on, when the character of Kate is running, trying to find a safe way out of the hypercube, and she sort of sees her own room passing through a room in the past where she herself sees it for the first time. That's when you realize that that's what's happening. A room from the future is passing through a room in the past.
We had to come up with some sort of science that would work for the passing room sequence, whereby the rooms would first become unstable. You'd see the ripples and then the constant ripples. And then all of a sudden they would become transparent. And then once it became transparent, you could see the one cube that was going to come now into the next cube. And it's almost like a moment of settling, and then it moves forward and starts to pass through the next. So it was 3 stages. The rooms become unstable, the rooms become transparent, and then the rooms start passing through each other. Initially, when the rooms were to become unstable, they were even shot on set as shakes. Thankfully they didn't do camera shakes, but they were supposed to be added later in post-production. But as we started talking about the high concept of the hypercube itself, we thought, well, it wouldn't shake. You know, these are just two timelines passing through each other. So the idea of people shaking inside the cube was a little 50s sci-fi, and we decided we were going to abandon that altogether. Basically, if it was going to become unstable or timelines were going to pass through each other, nothing was going to shake or rumble. It was just going to do it. In one case, a ripple comes down a wall and the floor actually drops about 1.5 feet, and it sends Max and Sasha, you know, a few steps to the left or right. Another indicator to show that the walls were becoming unstable was after Max is thrown off the wall, we see an embossed version of him up on the wall. And what that really represents is another timeline of Max. You know, it's like a freeze frame of the past. And that's the first indicator to the people that, hey, you know what, something's going on here and it's not good. And then a few minutes later, the portal pops out, and now they know they are in a bad situation. They're not sure what it is, they're not sure what's happening to the cube, but it's not good.
The passing room sequence features one cube that passes through the cube that we're currently in from another dimension. The quality of that cube is kind of shimmery and a bit magical, so the virtual cube was obviously used during that sequence for the room that was passed through. This is obviously something that we couldn't shoot on set. Two physical cubes could not be passed through each other. So the plates were shot in the normal cube, sometimes with green screen if other effects had to be happening behind or if characters needed to be in front of the shimmer. And then as the room passed through, that was all the virtual cube treated with the shimmer effect.
The layers in terms of like the warbly wall stuff, that was more of a 2D kind of effect that went on top of the 3D wall. There was multiple layers for that. I think like, you know, just different kind of displacements that went on top of the wall, and that as it moved into frame, different transparencies and stuff kind of gave you that effect.
One thing we tried to be very conscious of when one cube was passing into the next was that we weren't creating some sort of digital trash compactor. So in order to show what was actually going to happen to the people if they stayed in the cube as one passed into another, the briefcase was set there. And as they see it go from one cube to the next, it doesn't blow up, it doesn't get squashed, but it ages.
The briefcase was 100% CG for the shots in which it was being destroyed. There was a briefcase on set that McGuire obviously held, which we got a hold of after the shooting, measured it precisely and recreated the briefcase in CG to be able to destroy it with the wall.
And I thought, wouldn't it be fun if it was a place where parallel realities crossed over? I was always fascinated by this sort of science fiction concept of meeting yourself. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun if the door opened to another cube room, and then a character saw themselves, they thought they were looking at a mirror, and then the reflection in the mirror grabbed them, and suddenly another character behind them got killed. And that's sort of the idea of how Simon's head coming off came.
The whole sequence where Paley dies had to match the moment when we saw Simon's head taken off in a previous scene. Our problem with both those scenes was what can come through and take off Simon's head and what can come in and grab Paley's legs. We decided that if rooms can move around in parallel universes and there can be rooms with multiple timelines, then can one room pass through another in a multiple timeline? Like multiple parts of the room is passing through at various different stages. So that's where the whole idea of these geometric shapes coming out of the walls came from.
In creating the effect, we also had to come up with some concept that would allow time for escape and for Simon to decide whether to save Mrs. Paley or not, because after all, he was basically standing there and interrogating and torturing her. And then at that point, he hadn't gone crazy enough to allow her to be killed, so sort of pushed on by the character of Julia, Simon, in the last moment, decides to save Mrs. Paley. So we had to have these sort of slow-moving crystals that then sped up that would give Simon time to save Mrs. Paley. The idea of having two rooms that worked in different time speeds came from Sean Hood's original script of Hypercube. The idea that there were these time gears inside the walls, when you came too close to the time gears, either they would slow you down or really speed you up until a body part shrank off and fell off, or you died. Then that evolved into Max and Julia, as they're starting to sort of get romantically involved, suddenly the room they're in becomes temporarily unstable, it's unstable in time, and they suddenly start moving much faster and therefore grow old, and eventually we see that they die very quickly in that room. And then again, when Andre came on as the director, he was interested in the idea of time shifts, but not so much in having visually representing time gears, because he really felt that he wanted the cube to be, clean, pristine, white light and everything based on cubes. So the time gears had to go, but the concept of time changing stayed.
What the hell?
When we first got the script, one of the most interesting things to us in terms of possibilities for enhancing the film using computer animation was the razor sphere scene. I think, to the best of my recollection, the razor sphere in the original script was called the gear sphere, and was actually composed of a number of concentric circles of gears that rotated through each other and had razor sharp edges that would then go and chop up anything in its path.
Well, in Sean Hood's original draft of the script, the razor sphere started as a series of circular spinning blades. And then when Andre Sekula, the director, came along, he had this idea of basing most of our traps, in fact most of our effects in the movie, on cubes. So then it was transformed into a series of spinning razor-sharp cubes, but there were so many cubes that they made up a sphere. And in the end, I think that it was just as dangerous as the original concept, if not more so.
The design of the razor sphere continued throughout pre-production and throughout editing as sort of the needs for the film changed. We had a number of different tests that really went on for months. The actual look and texture of the razor sphere was something that went through a number of iterations with the director and the producer and us, throwing out different ideas, trying different looks for the razor sphere. Eventually we settled on a kind of pearly substance that Andre liked, that had kind of an iridescent nature, sort of a glow, but not quite incandescent or fluorescent or glowing, an actual light bulb, but did have that kind of otherworldly dimensional quality to it. In researching how to render the surface, a number of technical issues come up, such as the razor sphere casting shadows on itself, the razor sphere reflecting the scene around it, and until we kind of honed in on the actual final design and look and color and texture and shading of the razor sphere, and how fast it moved and how fast it spun inside itself, and whether it was angry or sad or slow or fast, how it bounced off the walls. So all those were questions that really weren't completely answered until really when we started delivering the final shots for the film.
Also, it was interesting, one of my favorite parts of the movie and about creating the razor sphere effect was this idea that it really reflected the people that it saw, kind of almost frozen in time. And that was to me, one of the eeriest moments in that sequence was when Kate and Sasha, the blind girl, are sitting in the corner and the razor sphere passes close to their face, and you see their reflection on this wide part of the blade.
One of the challenges in shooting the razor sphere sequence was that the actors had to be believably scared of this flying object. It was a challenge for the actors to have to react to an object that was supposed to be flying around in the scene but wasn't actually there.
It's moving. It's Billy, no!
So we used a number of tools on set to keep the eye line on track. A big green ball at the end of a stick that we kind of flew through the scene and removed later. Green ping pong balls hanging on fish line, just to keep the eye line correct so that it always would appear that the actors were looking at something as it was flying towards them and trying to kill them. Many times we didn't even know where the Razor Sphere would be flying, as a lot of the scene would be reconstructed later in the editing room.
I felt a lot of the shots of Kate and Sasha moving around the enlarged Razor Sphere were too tight, and I wanted to get wide on several occasions just so you could see the enormous size of the Razor Sphere, which was really occupying the entire room. So it wasn't shot wide, so what were we going to do? I basically took a shot of Kate that was close up, that she occupied the whole frame, and I just put that to the bottom left of the screen and opened it up, and we filled in the rest of the missing cube with the virtual cube and put the Razor Sphere on top.
We have to show a very detailed mutilation of a guy in like 100 frames. So it was kind of challenging to find something that kind of looked like the two elements were melting together, like that it was actually happening and chopping this guy up. The director and production didn't want to go too gory with it, so we had to kind of keep our blood down to a certain level, as well as we wanted to keep the shots continuous. If we splatter blood on walls, the next shot's going to have blood on his wall. So we kept it all within a certain field of the Razor Sphere. So it was more like a vacuum than anything else. So he would get initially sucked up and then chopped up, and you see him for a few frames. During the testing, we experimented with chopping up his body in larger pieces and smaller pieces. I think we chopped up his legs and his torso a little bit. It became pretty gory, so we mainly just centered around the arm for the actual shots. Hard part wasn't thinking of cool things. I think the hard part was narrowing down and picking one specific thing that we thought was cool, which was, initially his arm. That's kind of where we center a lot of our design around, was his first real tear that the Razor Sphere takes out of him. Like, it takes a chunk out of him in the shot before. It's just like a nip, and then as soon as we get into him, I guess they'll see. We chopped him up pretty good. So on set, they shot Jerry with a green screen rig. I think he was completely on green screen, so also in these shots, it's a CG room. So we had to do rig removal in 2D to make it just him kind of floating around the room. Then we did a post 2D move on Jerry to kind of give him a more of a floaty, kind of jerky motion to make him actually look like he's getting gobbled up. From that, we eroded out his arm and slowly cut it into segments. I think it was about 20 segments from the photo reference. And then we built artificial insides, which we shot on set. We shot some gore elements, some meat. So that was kind of the blood and guts inside the arms. And then there was like hundreds of just little pieces of skin and shirt and pants. And I think we had sweater in there somewhere, as well as we had some simulated blood, like particle simulations that were splattering all over the place. So there was quite a few elements there. So it was a real hybrid between 2D and 3D. A lot of tracking, so that things stuck on and seemed like they were actually part of him.
The Razor Sphere Eats Sunglasses shot is one shot that was created 100% in the computer. The room in that shot, as well as the camera move, is completely CG. The sunglasses are CG, and the Razor Sphere attacking them is all CG. And the idea was that shot would need to cut seamlessly with the shot that came before it, the shot that came after it. Well, the ending of the film actually went through a number of different interpretations and variations as we went through the editing process. The original end of the film, as it was scripted, had the entire cube being deconstructed around Kate until Kate had no option but to jump into the floor portal. As she jumped through, she fell into another cube, a new pristine cube that wasn't damaged, and then all of a sudden the side doors and the top doors and the floor doors open up and streams of mercury-like people walk into the cube. These people are reminiscent of all the characters that she's met throughout the film, but they are kind of constructed of this liquid metal substance. The people keep flowing into the cube, walking around and crossing over each other until the entire cube is filled up with the substance that Kate is now lying in, and we transition to the end shot where Kate is lifted up out of the cube by the guys in the plastic suits, and she's taken to meet the people that actually were responsible for putting her in there.
And so what the whole sequence of it may be a matter of time. When Kate flashed back to her hearing people say that throughout the film was to sort of underline the idea that, oh my God, this number 60659 that I'm seeing is is the time this thing is all gonna go, blow to hell.
Maybe they're not room numbers. Maybe somebody else figured something out.
Oh, don't worry, dear. It's just a matter of time.
I always thought that time was considered to be the fourth dimension.
Some things should never be created. They exist for theoretical purposes only.
The whole thing implodes. It's only a matter of time.
We eventually ended up cutting out because everybody felt that really we were beating a dead horse. Everybody understood that 60659 was the time, and so there was no reason to keep flashing back to people saying it's a matter of time, because we got it. We got it by cutting to the watches and Kate's reaction to it.
The end sequence, of course, features the deconstruction of the hypercube, which takes place over a number of phases. The first phase being swishes of negative energy that appear behind Kate, kind of without her knowing, and then she sees that the cube is being deconstructed. These swishes of energy actually wipe on this transparency in the walls. So the walls are no longer opaque, but they kind of become this glass-like substance whereby she can see through to the actual infinite nature of the cubes and realize that these rooms go on really forever, and there is really no telling how many rooms actually do exist in this place. The next phase is that as the outer cubes begin to contract inward, cracks form on the glass of the cube that she is in. And these cracks form, creating these pieces that then disintegrate away. Instead of revealing the infinity of cubes behind the wall, it actually reveals that there's nothing outside.
Once we had the model, we were kind of fortunate to do whatever we wanted with it in terms of breaking it apart. We actually took different pieces towards the end and blew them off into space and animated individual components differently. We put some kind of weird deformers through the walls and took the textures and kind of cracked them up and did a bunch of tests where we could actually deconstruct the cube for sure.
What the film was lacking, we thought at that point in editing, was you never really got to see outside the cube. And we felt that we could show this and show really how the cube was constructed, show the infinite nature, the four-dimensional nature of the cube, how the rooms looped in on themselves, and really kind of create this massive structure of millions and billions of cubes to give the viewer really a sense of what went on and how this thing was constructed.
Initially, when Kate looked out the portal and saw blackness, we were going to pull back through a bunch of cubes that were disintegrating and go around various bits of framework. And the one thing that we realized was it was really too early to come out and see the cube disintegrating. Eventually, we decided that Kate would look out the window and we would pull out and there would just be blackness, which is confusing, but it also reinforces the idea in a hypercube, you can be at 0 and infinity at the same time. You can have nothing or you can have everything. So that worked for that. But in the meantime, Ernie and myself went to Mr. X and they developed this incredible roller coaster ride of a shot for that moment. And we both looked at each other and said, that's wonderful, but that's not going there, but we know exactly where it should go. And it became the moment when Kate jumps through the portal at the end.
As she jumps into it, we would expect that she would fall into this world of nothingness, when in fact she finds herself barreling through the infinity of the cubes on this great roller coaster ride that lands her back into one solid, pristine cube that ends up being the end warehouse where she meets the government and the people that actually were responsible for placing her in there.
What is it really? It wasn't actually mercury. At the end, you'll see the whole cube kind of melt down into this liquid. So it kind of has a life of its own. It almost like it is the whole cube. So to sum that up was a little tricky. We had to keep it science fiction, but not magical. So it had a reality to it that that the viewers can relate to, like, what mercury's like, the kind of its properties, but also, as you'll see, Kate is dragged out of this mysterious liquid that you're just introduced at the last minute. So it was kind of a challenge to make it kind of have the same sort of feeling as the other parts of the movie, because it was a brand new element. The actual mercury we generated with the software Real Flow and Real Wave. It's like mathematical waves that were generated. Like, there's a lot of little ripples. It's very subtle. We wanted it to be a very subtle effect. So what we did, we tracked in 3D objects to all the actors' feet, and then collided that with a CG plane of Mercury. So it would ripple as they stepped. It would sync up. That was the real effect. That was really how we tied into the scene, was synchronizing the footsteps with the ripples of the waves. As well as another big challenge with that was reflecting the actors into the Mercury, because on set we had plenty of reference of the room, and we could get, we could light and make the Mercury look like it's there, but to make the actors look like they're actually touching it was a challenge in itself. So really all we had was the collision between the actors' feet and, well, Kate's whole body at some point.